Thank you all for standing by, and welcome to the 25th webinar of our series entitled Communicating with the Public About Climate Change, Understanding Global Warming's Six Americas. These webinars are an initiative of the Ohio State University Climate Change Outreach Team, a multi-departmental effort within the university, led by OSU Extension, Ohio Sea Grant, Bird Polar Research Center, and a number of other OSU departments, to help localize the climate change issue for Ohioans and Great Lakes residents. My name is Christina Dieckes from Ohio Sea Grant and Stone Laboratory, and joining me today is Dr. Teresa Myers. Teresa is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University and an Ohio State graduate. She is currently co-principal investigator on a NASA grant investigating public trust in NASA's climate change research, public understanding of NASA's web-based educational materials on climate change. She specializes in research methodology and advanced data analysis techniques in the context of communication and public opinion research, and has published on climate change, data analysis, and foreign policy. We're delighted to have Teresa here today to discuss how segments of the American public think about climate change and how to effectively communicate with these different groups. But before we do that, a few logistical issues as we get started. During our presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Afterwards, at about 12:40 or so, we will conduct a question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat feature located on the right-hand side of your screen. I'll collect and pose your questions out to Teresa at the end of her presentation. We have almost 800 participants registered for this webinar, a great diverse group representing governmental agencies, academia, and nonprofit groups in the Great Lakes and around the country. Please keep those questions coming throughout the presentation, and we'll have a great Q&A session. As a reminder, the webinar is being recorded and will be posted onto our website for later viewing. Also, we'll post a webinar survey in the chat feature toward the end of the hour. Please take a few minutes to fill out this survey. It'll help us continue to bring you better webinars. Without any further delay, I would like to introduce Teresa Myers from the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University, who will present Communicating with the Public About Climate Change, Understanding Global Warming's Six Americas. Teresa, you should be unmuted, and I'm about to give you the presenter ball, so you can go ahead and get started whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Christina, and welcome to everyone who is joining us. I'm excited to present to you some work that we've been doing at the George Mason Center for Climate Change Communication in collaboration with the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication. So today, I would like to go through and talk about some of the work that we've been doing over the past 6 years on identifying your audience. So I will be explaining our work on global warming Six Americas and introducing you to those audience segments. And then I'm going to talk about some of the key strategic objectives you can have when communicating with these segments of the public. And finally, a few recommended key messages. So let's go ahead and get started. So first, I'm going to talk about this idea of identifying your audience. So presumably, many of you are climate scientists or or are involved in education and public outreach. And it can be really easy to just think about your audience as the general public. So thinking about, I want to communicate with the public about my area of interest. However, we argue that it's really important to get a more nuanced understanding of your audience, thinking about their beliefs and attitudes about the issue prior to when they come into contact with you. So we have done a series of national polls to identify audience segments in regard to the issue of climate change. So I'm going to present here what we call Global Warming Six Americas. So this is research that we've done which asks nationally representative sample of Americans their attitudes, beliefs, concerns, hopes about the issue of global warming. And so we asked them a battery of 36 questions, and then based on answers to those 36 questions, we identified segments of the public. So members of the public whose answers seem to be similar to one another across a variety of items. And this analysis identified 6 different groups of Americans. And what you see here on the slide are the segments by percentage of the population, ranging from the alarmed, which are about 12% of the population, and these have the highest belief certainty in global warming. They're concerned about this issue and motivated to take action. Down through the dismissive, which are about 10% of the population, these are pretty certain that global warming is not occurring. They're not concerned about the issue, and they're not motivated. But you'll notice that the plurality of the public is actually in these middle 4 segments, what we call the concerned, cautious, disengaged, and doubtful. And I'm going to be talking in more detail about the beliefs that each of these segments hold. But I think it's important to note that the majority of the public in these 4 segments, I think especially because when we think about this issue, it's easy to polarize the public and think, there are those who believe that it's occurring, and then there are those who we might call them denialists, we call them dismissive of climate science research. And so those are the 2 kind of minds we have in our head. But according to our analysis, that's only about 20% of the public. So about 80% of the public is in the middle. So they're less certain, and they have different questions than people at the ends of the spectrum here. So going into more detail, these 6 segments don't differ very much demographically, so in age, sex, race, or income, but they have very different beliefs about the issue of global warming. And I'm going to talk today about 4 key beliefs that are very different for each of the segments. And the reason I chose to talk about these 4 key beliefs are that these beliefs have been identified as really important predictors of communication outcomes. So outcomes such as the belief that various social actors, whether it be political actors like the president or Congress, or corporations, or just citizens themselves, should do more to address the issue of climate change, or support for various climate policies. And we found that these key beliefs of global warming is real, it's human caused, it's bad for people, and it's solvable are positive predictors of these outcomes. So people who hold these beliefs are also really likely to think that people should do something about it, and they're supportive of policies that would address the issue. So I'm going to go through each of these key beliefs and show you what our data shows about these 6 segments, 6 Americas, and how they stack up on these beliefs. So first, this belief of global warming is real. So what you see here on the screen is the average response for each of these segments to the question, do you think global warming is happening, and how certain are you? The size of the bubbles represents the proportion of the population that is in that segment. And you can see here the downward trend. So we have the alarmed who are, on average, extremely sure that global warming is happening. And then you have the dismissive who are somewhat sure that global warming is not happening on average. You'll see that most of the segments are above the midpoint. So most lean towards believing that global warming is happening, although they vary in their certainty. So on this key belief of it's real, many people believe that it's real, but they vary in their certainty. The second key belief is the belief that global warming is human caused. So this chart shows responses to the question, what is causing global warming? And they have the options of human activities, natural changes in the environment. They can choose to say both. They can volunteer that. That's an option that we give them. Or we say none of the above because global warming isn't happening. So what you see here are those people who are dismissive overwhelmingly say natural changes in the environment or none of the above because global warming is happening. The proportion of the public that believes that its human activities, or both, increases significantly as you go more towards the left of the continuum, towards the alarmed and concerned. So the alarmed, over 90% believe that human activities play some part in causing global warming. The third key belief is that global warming is bad for people. So I show here you responses to the question, when do you think global warming will start to harm people in the United States? And so people in the alarmed segment believe that on average people are being harmed right now or within the next 10 years, down to those who are dismissive, who believe that there will never be any harm. Most people, though, believe that the harm is likely to come within the next 50 years, which is their generation or their children's generation. Finally, the key belief of that global warming is solvable. So these are responses to the question, which of the following comes closest to your view? And we show the responses of humans could reduce global warming, but it's unclear if we will. And humans can reduce global warming, and we will. There are other options, such as we will not be able to reduce global warming. But here, these are the affirmative responses. And as you can see, the alarmed and concerned are pretty convinced that we're going to be able to address this issue. However, many people, the cautious and the disengaged, think it's about a 50-50 chance. Totally unsure of whether or not we can and will be able to reduce global warming. And then that drops significantly then for the doubtful and the dismissive. So this is a really key area for growth because communicating that it is possible to adapt and mitigate the issue of global warming is a really important message, as obviously as our data show, not everyone is convinced that that will occur. And it's certainly very few. You can see here the percentages are under 10% for all segments that we are going to successfully reduce global warming. So hopefully that gives you kind of a better understanding of where these segments kind of stack up on these four key beliefs of that global warming is real, it's human caused, it's bad for people, and it's solvable. So given those key beliefs and where the segments stand, we'd like to recommend some objectives. So if you are engaging with the public about any of these issues, either the component beliefs or the issue as a whole, what are some goals you can have? What are some realistic outcomes for each of these segments? So what we recommend is that you take time prior to your public addresses or your designing of your educational materials to think, okay, what types of audiences am I going to be coming into contact with? Am I getting to speak to those audiences who are already pretty engaged with the issue? And if so, what is my objective for speaking with them? Am I speaking likely to this broad middle segment, those who aren't really sure what to think about the issue, want some more information? Or am I likely to be speaking with those who are dismissive of the issue? So I'm going to go through and offer some recommendations for each of those segments. What are some objectives that are reasonable to have? So the first would be for these first two segments, the alarmed and the concerned. So you'll recall that these are people who are pretty sure that global warming is occurring. They think it's bad for people. They're likely to believe it's solvable. And so the recommended objective for these segments is activation. So these groups of people are ready to take action, but they're not really sure what to do. And so as communicators, what we can do is offer some suggestions for what they can do. They're primed, if you will. You know, they're ready to get out there. So for the alarmed, one thing that we can do is activate the alarmed as citizens, by which I mean, urging them to take action, to contact representatives, political representatives. So you see here a graph that displays responses to the question, over the past 12 months, how many times have you done each of the following? Written letters, emailed, or phoned government officials to urge them to take action to reduce global warming. And about a quarter of the alarm segment has already done that compared with many of the others. And it seems to be an action that people in this category are ready and able to take, especially if they're urged to do so. So that could be an objective that you have if you're likely to be talking to a group that are alarmed. Next, consider the concerned. So one way that the concern can be activated are as consumers. So you see here responses to the question, over the past 12 months, how many times have you done these things? Rewarded companies that are taking steps to reduce global warming by buying our products. And, between 40 and 50% of people in the concerned segment have already the past 12 months. So encouraging them to do that even more and to avoid companies that are not taking steps to reduce global warming is likely to be an action that they've already considered and are willing to take. And so having that as an objective of your communication with this group of people is a reasonable goal for these people to attain. So that's the first kind of section of segments, the alarmed and concerned, those who already care about this issue and are convinced that global warming is happening. The second group of people that I'm going to talk about are these in the middle. So those who are cautious, those who are totally disengaged with this issue, and those who are doubtful. So those who are cautious they think it's probably turning, they're somewhat sure, but they'd like more information about the issue, and they're not certain they really want to do anything about it. Those who are disengaged probably haven't spent much time thinking about this issue at all. They're not really motivated to think about this issue. They tend to be disengaged from current events and news as a whole. And those who are doubtful tend to lean more conservative. They think global warming might be occurring, but they're pretty doubtful about that, and they're not likely also to seek more information. So what's an objective that you could have if you're likely to be addressing this kind of middle segment of the public? There's a heavy emphasis in this on the visual depiction. So show this audience how climate change is occurring. Make it emotional and experiential. So emphasize the human dimensions of the issue and emphasize the emotional reactions that can be had from that, whether it's hope, fear, or whatever. Make it real and tangible rather than showing maybe graphs or charts or talking about trends. And as is often emphasized, make it local rather than global. So what do I mean by this? Overall, you're trying to achieve this kind of effect. You're trying to grab attention because this is an audience that is unlikely to want to attend to information unless their attention is really grabbed. I have a few examples of what this might look like. One is this community in Alaska that's experiencing a threat to their community because of climate change. And so they've put together an organization and a website that really emphasizes the many ways that these changes are affecting their lifestyles and their community as a whole. And so they really do a nice job of highlighting the real impacts to real people right now. And so they do a good job at addressing those beliefs of that climate change is real and that it's affecting people right now. Furthermore, just taking the example of impacts to Ohio, and this is taken from the Ohio Sea Grant page, just discussing the local impacts that climate change has in the region that you're speaking to. right? So these pictures and descriptions emphasize how climate change is and is projected to affect things like crop production and tree growth to the state of Ohio. So depending on what region you're in or you're speaking to, obviously coast, you can talk about sea level rise, stronger hurricanes. In the West, you might talk about forest fires, etc. So really thinking through, okay, where is my audience located geographically, and how is climate change or global warming likely to affect them in ways that they'll be able to see and notice. And then finally, the objective for people in the dismissive segment is just not to activate them against, people who are trying to communicate about climate change or global warming, right? This segment is pretty solidly convinced that global warming isn't occurring. They might be convinced that the science is biased, etc. And so angering this segment is likely to backfire because they've exhibited willingness to contact their political representatives, for example, and urge them not to take action on the issue of climate change, or they're likely to write in letters to the local newspaper, etc., and to talk with people in their community about it. So thinking through these segments, if you're likely to have members of this segment in your audience, think about how you can be respectful, how you can explain the science and explain the human impacts without threatening values that people in this segment might have. And we've heard from a number of public communicators about this issue that it can be pretty daunting to interact with people who are dismissive in a public forum. So here are just a few suggestions for interacting and engaging with people who are dismissive in a public forum. So it's highly likely, right, that they're going to get up during question and answer time and pose a question. And one thing we recommend is not thinking of this segment as your primary target audience, right? Because he or she is unlikely to be persuaded by evidence that you offer. On the whole, people from this segment think they have enough information already to make up their mind, and so they're not really interested in engaging more with this issue because their need for information has already been satisfied, and they've decided that they just don't believe it. However, there are likely to be other people in the audience who are either members of that middle public who have the same question, they've heard it, they're not really sure how to respond, or maybe even members of the alarmed and concerned who are really interested in knowing how to talk with people who have that same question. And so they're how we like to think of as the audience that we're attempting to communicate with when we engage with these skeptical questions. A good resource, there are several, but one good resource for preparing for these types of skeptic questions is Our Sustainable Earth, published in Reports on Progressive Physics. And so he has a section in that article that goes through 8 different common skeptical arguments and refers to peer-reviewed research that can be used in talking about that issue. So it's a nice summary of various common and popular skeptical beliefs and evidence that addresses those beliefs. So the key is to be respectful, brief, avoid getting into prolonged discussion. Communicate your position to the best that you're able, and then try and move on to other questions that people have. All right, so the objectives that we talked about are, activating those who are already convinced that it's occurring, informing experientially the middle segments of the public, and then avoiding angering the last segment. So what are some key messages that are likely to achieve those objectives? So I'm going to offer 3 key messages that you can focus on and as well as talk about some ideal messengers for each of these messages. So the first key message is that there is expert consensus about this issue. So this is the key belief that more than 95% of the experts are convinced that climate change is real and is human caused. So there's been a variety of work that's attempted to demonstrate this idea of consensus by the scientific community, or relative consensus by the scientific community. So this is work by Dorn and Zimmerman conducted in 2009, where they surveyed many scientists and asked them this question. It was just a very short questionnaire. I think it had 2 questions. And one was, do you think human activity is a significant contributing factor in changing mean global temperatures? And you see here that the general public was, between 50 and 60% believes that. And people who are active climatologists, who are active publishers on climate change, were, above 95%. You can also cite, reviews by the IPCC or the number of government official scientific societies who produced reports saying that they're convinced that climate change is real and that humans are affecting global warming. And so this is a really key important message to communicate. And there's a variety of ways that you might be able to do this. Some have suggested that using metaphors such as doctors and engineers and threats from hurricanes to kind of communicate this idea that even if there were some disagreement, a small percentage of disagreement among experts, you would likely be concerned if a large percent told you that there was a problem, and you'd be likely to take action. So this might be one way that you communicate this message. And this perception really matters. So we discussed at the beginning these 4 key beliefs that are linked to support for climate policies and for action by people. And we've done research that has shown that this perception of expert consensus influences belief. So that people who are convinced that there's scientific consensus are more likely to believe these key beliefs, and therefore more likely to support action by a variety of societal actors and various climate policies. Conversely, those who don't believe that there's scientific consensus are less likely to believe these things and less likely to support action or policies. So in May 2011, which is when this study was published, only about 40% of Americans believe that scientists think global warming is happening, and only 13% believe the range was between 81 and 100%. So thinking about who is ideally suited to offer this message, likely if you are a scientist yourself, a climate scientist yourself, if you're a spokesperson for a scientific agency, you're likely going to have a lot of trust and credibility in explaining that members of your field believe that humans are contributing. And so this can be a key message that you seek to communicate when you're interacting with various segments of the public. So one key message is this communication that experts are convinced that this is occurring. A second key message is that there are public health risks and benefits. So that is this idea that climate change influences people. So I'll let you take a minute to read these quotes by some experts in this area. So these quotes are really highlighting the need that to communicate that climate change is going to influence people. So you think about some of the iconic images associated with climate change. So what comes to your mind when I say climate change or global warming? It is very likely something like this: penguins and polar bears. These are some of the iconic images that various media organizations have used to represent this issue, and that many people report when we've asked them what comes to mind, what are the images. Overwhelmingly, is these types of images. So the problem with that is that these are animals that we have very little contact with personally. They're distant, they're remote, and they're not people, which, for large segments of the population, they're more likely to be motivated by human impacts rather than animal impacts. So you, Ian, talk about the human health implications for global warming and climate change, whether it's talking about the increase in asthma or breathing concerns, or whether it's talking about the threat to vulnerable populations such as the elderly and the poor because of increased extreme heat events, etc. So really emphasizing the human face to this issue is a key message, and we can then communicate that climate change is bad for people too. So you can also talk about this in terms of that key belief of it being solvable, right? So we can talk about that our nation, the United States, is currently, the transportation system is evolved around a network of highways, but that we can work towards building communities that have lots of walking paths and biking paths, and where we live closer to our schools and jobs, or maybe even work from home. So we can talk about the positive ways that adopting things like walking and bike paths are likely to influence human health and the issue of climate change. So then we're talking not only about how climate change affects people, but also this idea that it's one action that we can take to solve the issue of global warming is also going to be beneficial for human health. So organizations such as the CDC or public health officials are in prime position to deliver this message of the harmful effects of climate change and the hopeful human health effects of mitigating climate change. The final message that I'm going to talk about is this idea that linking weather and extreme weather with climate change. So I show you here the results from a recent study that talk about that where people were asked the question, some people say that global warming made each of the following events worse. How much do you agree or disagree? And so we asked about a variety of issues, so such as the warm winter, high summer temperatures, drought, floods, hurricanes, etc. So you see here that over 50% of the public either somewhat agrees or strongly agrees that global warming made each of the following events worse. Now, with the recent Hurricane Sandy, Bloomberg kind of famously made this link on the cover of Bloomberg's Business Week, where he kind of made some very strong claims about that Hurricane Sandy should serve as a wake-up call. And while this isn't necessarily the most respectful way, this linking of these catastrophic events and with the science that shows that global warming is predicted to make hurricanes stronger and occur more often might be an important message for you to deliver. And specifically thinking about who is primed to deliver this message, research that we've done shows that America's weathercasters are a vital community to activate in this way because they're extremely trusted as sources of information. The majority of the public still tunes in to find out about their local weather, and they have the ability to help viewers understand this kind of very high level and abstract idea of climate change in a concrete manner with ways that they can personally experience. So, for example, a weathercaster might talk about the number of days that temperatures have gone over 101 in the past summer, and compare that to the historical trend. Or they might be able to talk about, how the flowering trees came earlier this year and how that's been a trend or whatever. So weathercasters are prime messengers for this linking of weather with climate change. So I've kind of briefly discussed our audience segments that we've identified through repeated polling for the past 6 years. I've talked about some of the work that we've done that links these key beliefs to outcomes and some of our recommendations based on that. But there's a lot more information that we have that's available. So we have reports available at climatechangecommunication.org. We also have recently released a report that deals with extreme weather, people's beliefs about extreme weather and climate change. We have reports that deal with political implications, etc. So please visit our website and utilize those resources as you are considering and preparing for various public forums that you have. Then finally, I would like to recognize some of the people on our team who have been instrumental in this research at both Mason and at Yale, and some of our funders as well. So that is what I have for today, and I guess I'll turn it back over to Christina, I think, to ask for the question and answer session.
Thanks, Teresa. I have quite a number of questions from people. A lot of them are dealing with how Sandy and also looking back a little bit, Katrina might have affected sort of the 6 different segments as far as percentage of people in those segments go.
Okay, I don't have the specific ability to link those events to the percentage of segments, but I can speak to that question more broadly. So some work that I don't have depicted here has shown that the middle 4 segments, so those who are less sure, are influenced by these personal experiences. Experiencing a hurricane or a drought, or a forest fire, or even mediated experiences of, we were all attending to the news about Hurricane Sandy. Those middle segments are likely to increase their belief in climate change when those events happen. However, the end segments tend to have their perceptions of weather more influenced by their beliefs rather than experiences influencing their beliefs, if that makes sense.
A few people asked about global warming versus using the term climate change and sort of expressing concerns about them not necessarily being interchangeable, but understood the same way by the public. Can you talk a little bit about those 2 terms and what language choice might be better for communicators?
Sure. So that's a common question. It's not one that I would say I can offer a definitive answer to. There has been work in this area kind of reflecting, how do choices about this influence audiences and audiences' understanding. So you see here on this slide kind of brief definitions of these 2 terms and the nuances and their differences in definition. And then here's some work that we did that looks at what term audiences prefer. So this is audience-driven research. And you can see here that the modal response is no preference. So across all the segments, most people have no preference. The alarmed prefer the term global warming, but there doesn't really seem to be a clear preference among the other segments. This obviously is just how people prefer to hear about it. And this is a kind of goal for future research for us, is to really understand the differences in how people respond when we use global warming and when we use climate change. So in the research that we've done about the 6 Americas, all of that battery of questions uses the term global warming. But research that we're in the planning stages for right now, we're going to do half of the segments, or half of the questions using global warming. So half the participants will receive global warming and half will receive climate change, and see how that influences how people respond.
And that is something that eventually would be published as one of those reports that we've been seeing coming out over the past couple of years.
Yep.
We had one question that asked about, let me track it down again. Quite a few questions at this point. One question asking about who exactly was surveyed for the project, and then one was also interested in recommendations for tailoring the message to very young children, since those are to not be included in that initial survey.
Great. Okay. So the first question is, who was surveyed? We worked with a survey company called Knowledge Network that works very hard to recruit people from nationally representative polling. So that means trying to get representatives of every combination of demographics that you can imagine. So age, 18 plus, so these are adults who are American citizens, but trying to get representative proportions of gender, of age, of income, of race, etc. So they work hard to find samples of the public that represent the U.S. as a whole. So this is similar to how polling organizations at the political level that we all saw in the past few weeks and had the debates about the validity of that, but that's the type of methodology we use. The second is dealing with very young children. So we have done one study that deals not necessarily with very young children, but more like teenagers. And we found that for younger participants, they kind of cluster towards the middle of the segment. So they're more likely to be unsure of what they think. And they're more likely to be interested in the experiential aspect. So tailoring it to the experiential aspects. A resource I might point you to is Climate Kids at climate.nasa.gov, and they have good resources for kids, for materials for kids, and for educators who are interested in talking about this in the classroom or in formal education standpoint. So that's Climate Kids at climate.nasa.gov.
Okay. Someone asked, and this was repeated in different formats throughout, is presenting to a mixed audience the alarms down to the dismissive, should they start at the lowest level and assume that the alarms will still be on board? Or would it be better to tailor towards the middle segment?
Yeah, so we would recommend tailoring towards the middle segment. That second objective that I had of really helping them to understand the issue more through localizing it or through experiential messaging. Because, like I talked about with the dismissive, it's unlikely that you're going to persuade that group. And the alarmed are already, they care about this issue, and they're going to be excited to hear more information about that. So, yeah, targeting it towards the middle if you're likely to be addressing a pretty mixed audience.
This also came up a few times. You attribute the relatively low numbers of the public who feel something can be done about climate change to pessimism or political disenchantment or a lack of information about what actions they can take?
Yes. So I think again.
Could you repeat that? It sounds like you're breaking up on the phone.
Oh, sure. I'd be happy to. So I think there are multifaceted reasons for that suppression of belief that this issue can be solved. So that could include political disenfranchisement. It could include a lot of the discussion about this issue in the past 10 or 20 years has really been focused on convincing the public that climate change is real. And so there have often been pretty graphic images designed to kind of communicate the seriousness of the problem. So there's a Time magazine cover that mimics the drug campaign, this is your brain on drugs, and it has an egg in a frying pan that was mimicked for the issue of global warming. So a lot of the messages have focused much more on the problems associated with global warming than the potential solutions. And so even An Inconvenient Truth the movie had a lot of information about the evidence that it's occurring and the impacts that that's going to have. And then just towards the very end of the movie, had very little discussion of what can be done. So as a whole, public discussion of this issue has focused on the evidence and impacts rather than on potential solutions. So I think that's probably very likely a result, or that's why this belief is low. A study that we did that focused on the message of public health and compared that to an environmental message and a national security message found that people were actually pretty hopeful when they were exposed to a message about public health, and specifically that kind of slide I showed about the real benefits of building walking paths and bike paths.
I think you're breaking up again. Sorry.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. I'm sorry about that. I'm not sure what's going on here. So we tested that and found that a public health frame, so emphasizing the benefits of human health to building walking paths and bike paths and stuff, resulted in hope among participants.
Okay. Since we do have quite a few people on who are, communicators, climate educators, can you talk a little bit about whether it's important to use the key messages consistently together, or if there's standalone messages that could be used for shorter presentations?
Yeah, I think that these key beliefs can be standalone messages. So depending on, who you are and what your area of expertise is likely to be, along with, time limitations, et cetera. I think choosing one or two of these key messages could be an effective strategy. Of course, if you have the ability and time to address all of them, that's even better.
Someone also just said that it might be a good thing to communicate how science in itself is done, and using that to address skeptics that might be, at a public presentation. And someone else was asking about some talking points if you do get into the situation where a dismissive person stands up and sort of addressing that conversation in public.
Sure. Okay. So, I'm sorry, what was the first part of that question?
It's using education about how science works, peer review process, all of those ideas to help with addressing dismissive members of the public.
Yeah, I think to the extent that we can make science and explain what the process is like and how scientists arrive at this conclusion, I think that can be doubly beneficial. So it can address skepticism by showing that this is a very rigorous process with lots of checks and balances. And also to the extent that we can form narratives, so we can make scientists real people and we can demonstrate how they came to these questions and what process they struggled through to come to their conclusions, and make it a story, make science a story, a narrative, that can engage those members of the public who might be less interested in just hearing the conclusion. So I think that that's a real way to kind of do double duty there in addressing skepticism and in engaging middle members of the audience. And then the second part of the question was talking points. That's a little bit trickier because it depends a little bit on the types of questions that are being addressed. Here's one example. So if someone brings up the argument that, there have been big changes in the past, so what we're seeing right now could be just a product of natural variation, kind of random variability in the climate system. And so one, you could talk about how actually scientists now have the ability to identify predictors or what influenced those changes in the past. They weren't simply things that happened at random, but rather there are things like decrease in volcanic activity or shifts in ocean currents that can explain why there were these warming periods in the past. And that we can now compare those times in the past with the present, and the only explanation that remains is the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Something like that, trying to put in simple terms, the work that refutes the idea that they're bringing up. But of course, you're probably not going to be able to address any question that's answered, but to the best of your ability at the given time.
Okay. Someone asked about the value of talking about generational equity, by which they mean talking about this in terms of what children and grandchildren, future generations will experience. I think this was part of the conversation about what values most affect people in those communications.
Sure, absolutely. So the general principle there is the more immediate you can tie it to now or to your children, potentially grandchildren, the more we're likely to pay attention as people, because the tangible, the immediate is something that we just prioritize more than thinking. It's much more difficult for us to think 50 or 60 years in the future than 5 to 10 years in the future. So generational equity is an important kind of moral value, and there are ways to talk about that, but it's probably more vivid to try and connect it more with what's going on now, and with what's likely to go on in the next 10 to 20 years.
Do you have recommendations for addressing the uncertainty that's always associated with talking about climate change?
Yes, but again, nothing ironclad. So I'll take the link between weather and climate as one example. So we know that any one event can't be linked definitively to climate change. Like, we can't say that a hurricane was caused by climate change. Instead, we can talk about the fact that they're increasing in a frequency and magnitude. So we can talk about them occurring more often and being stronger. So one analogy that I like that illustrates that concept is the analogy of steroids in sports, so that a star player might hit home runs without the use of steroids, but that same player, if taking steroids, is likely to hit more home runs, and they're likely to hit those home runs further. And so climate change is like putting steroids into the climate. And so that we're producing events that are stronger and more frequent. So that deals with the uncertainty of linking any given event to climate change. But in terms of dealing with the uncertainty surrounding any scientific topic or climate change specifically, talking about the ideas and beliefs that there is really strong evidence for that climate change is occurring. Say that the extent to which it's occurring, the magnitude, all of that. There's some uncertainty, but scientists agree that it is occurring, and there's some uncertainty and disagreement around some of the particulars about that belief. Focusing on what is agreed upon and not focusing on the areas of disagreement. Acknowledging the areas of disagreement and uncertainty, but also emphasizing the areas of agreement.
I think that is actually a really good natural break point for us. I want to mention that Teresa has agreed to answer some of the questions that we didn't get to today in writing, and we will be able to post those responses on our website. I'm putting the link to that into the chat box right now. I want to, again, thank Teresa for her willingness to talk to us today about the Yale Project of Climate Change Communication, about communication strategies, and about all of the questions that we've had today. Thank you all so much for asking. We've had a really great discussion. A thank you to NOAA, the National Sea Grant College Program, and The Ohio State University for funding this webinar. I did want to remind you again that our survey URL for the webinar is in the chat feature. Please take a few minutes to fill that out. It really only takes a couple of minutes. We would like your input as we develop a regional climate site, so please take the time, if you could at all. I also want to refer you to the resources in an archive of all of our previous webinar presentations, which are located on our changingclimate.osu.edu website, and again, that link is in the chat box. The webinar series is sponsored by the OSU Climate Change Outreach Team, and will continue next month with Phil Sharp, President of Resources for the Future, who will be discussing energy policies and climate change, and we'll email you when the registration for that is open. Thank you again to Teresa Myers from George Mason University and all the participants on this webinar. We hope this was beneficial and hope you'll join us again in December. Thank you very much and have a great afternoon.